Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome to Sovereign Heart. I'm Rachele, and I am here with Jenna Faye Madden, who I met, probably maybe about a year ago, and I don't even know how we crossed paths, but there was some frequency that was aligned, and I knew I needed to connect with her. She is a conscious leadership coach and business strategist for female entrepreneurs, and really been a mentor, a support, and really influenced a lot of the back end in my business and helped me with mindset. But not only mindset and strategy, she's really just aligned with my values and the way that I see the world. And it's such a reminder to me too of like, pick the people in your world that supports you, that share your values. Use discernment with who you choose to help you create the vision for your business. It's so important. And I'm so grateful that I came across Jenna. So welcome here. We've got a lot that we could explore today.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for having me and for the great intro. I know we're going to have a really great, heart-opening, expansive conversation today, and I absolutely love the conversations that we have together, the work that you do in the world, and it really has been an honor to be a mentor, a friend, a sister on this last year or so that we've crossed paths, and it feels like it's kind of coming into like a new era by having this
Mhm.
conversation. Like a whole new chapter has really been emerging lately. So what better time to
Yeah,
record this?
yeah, exactly. Well, before we dive in, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you do, your mission on this planet essentially, but also how does sovereignty show up in your world in love, life, and business?
I love all of this. Yeah, for those who don't know me, and maybe even if you do, I feel like we're all always expanding and shifting. So who I am today is probably different than who I
Yeah.
was yesterday anyway. So a bit of who I am now and my path and my journey, really the short version of that is my work in the world is I call myself a leadership coach and a business strategist because my business, my company, my heart, my soul is behind my brand, Soul Meets Strategy, which really is as it sounds. It blends the energetics, the leadership, the mindset, and I feel like ultimately the identity piece of who we are becoming as women in our business. Because really, business is just the vehicle. Like it's connected to me to our soul path, our expression, our mission, and it's a vehicle for transformation, a creative outlet for us as women, a way to make money in this current system and paradigm that we're in, and ultimately a way to reach people with our magic and make impact. So that's where the other side of my biz comes in, which is the practical side, the actual
Mhm.
how to do things to get more money in the hands of conscious women. So the strategy, the marketing, the social media, the offer design, really in a nutshell is to have a simple, scalable, sustainable business that actually sets us free. So that is what my work in the world is all about. And I feel like sovereignty comes in so many ways because it's one of my biggest values. It's a big part of my work and brand as well. Because to be honest, people come to me for business. That's the sexy piece. But really, what my secret mission is helping people really ultimately step into deeper sovereignty, be empowered as we navigate this collective transition and new earth great awakening that we are in right now on this planet. And that's where like the business being the vehicle part really comes
Mhm.
in. So sovereignty to me, and I like how you framed it as how does it show up in these different ways, because it is an all-encompassing kind of
Yeah.
energy. It has this kind of holistic link to it because sovereignty can be applied in all of our areas to me, which really comes back to internal power of how we're navigating things, our identity of who we know ourselves to be, and really how are we leading ourselves in our relationship dynamics, in our business, in the world, like taking that self responsibility. But also, it comes to me with a sense of wisdom, education, kind of being a truth seeker, whatever that looks like for each person. But it's basically how we navigate within and outside of the system in this transitional time.
Yeah, and you said it so well, even though it's not the sexiest of words, like just taking that self-responsibility and that inner inner leadership and like sense of power back too is such an important part of really stepping into those next levels of expansion. I'd love to hear more about, like, you've hinted at it now a few times, of just like the transition that we're going through on this planet. I'd love to hear in your words what that looks like from like a practical standpoint, like how are the average Joes functioning in today's society, but also how are we elevating as a society as well, in because business, like you said, is the avenue, and how that shows up in business, but also how does that show up in day-to-day life? Because I think as women too, we can't ignore frequency and energy, and also how those things impact how we can lead our businesses as women.
Yeah, I love this question as well because it does ripple into all of the
Hmm.
areas. It is so intrinsically connected. And the way I think about what's going on right now in the world in kind of a grounded but also esoteric kind of way is we are shifting right now in really it comes back to frequency in the collective experience of what's happening in the world, which is also impacted by the individual experience. And so, for a long time, humans have been operating in this 3D kind of frequency to me, which very much is rooted in things like survival.
Yeah.
It's like very like lack, scarcity, ego driven. And, we could go down the rabbit holes more if you want. But to me, I think about this as there's a lot of like enslavement, there's been a lot of programming. This is not the real human template for how we're actually meant to operate. And at the same time, this is where sovereignty comes in. Humans have consented to this, both
Hmm.
consciously and unconsciously. Like it's all a consent based system. Most just aren't really aware of that. And actually, now we're in a very interesting time in this transition because right now it kind of looks worse in many ways, I think, on the outside because it's all being illuminated, like light is going on the shadows, and we're
Yeah.
kind of seeing people have their head in the sand like little ostriches pretending, and I've had moments myself where I'm like, oh man, it was so much easier before I woke up. Oh, I wish I could just not see all these crazy things and corruption and stuff going on in our world, because that is still how a lot of people are
Hmm.
operating right now. And that's kind of like the 3D energy. To me, a lot of us who have been on the awakening path in some form or another are existing in kind of a 4D energy. It's elevated from the 3D. There's a lot more conscious awareness. There's healing happening both in this lifetime, but also ancestrally. But we're kind of dancing with this 5D reality that people talk about, which, to be clear, that's not like the end game. Like, that's kind of
Yeah.
like the baseline to me of like the new earth frequency and reality. But there's many more dimensions of embodiment beyond 5D. But 5D is kind of like the new baseline, of what we're working towards normalizing, which on a frequency level is rooted in unity. It's rooted in love. It's really us coming back to remembrance and wholeness. And naturally, from like an external kind of place, it will eliminate the need for things like fiat money and government and all of these things. Because if everybody's operating from their heart space and living in purpose and passion and unity and community, well, you don't need those things. But I'm open to a crazy solar flash or some divine intervention where it kind of just changes overnight as if by magic. But regardless of that happening or not, in the meantime, I feel like this is where sovereignty and
Yeah.
conscious choice and self responsibility comes in because we're all playing a role in this transition right
Hmm.
now. And there's like so many microcosms of that which are being illuminated. Like, number one, I don't think that everybody is meant to wake up in
Yeah.
this current linear timeline. I actually think, and I used to judge people who were asleep, in the muggle world. I kind of think I joke with my husband sometimes, the average Walmart shopper, like that they're not awake. How do they not see it? But I actually think some of those people, maybe not all of them, are the most ascended people of us all in terms of souls, because they're really here to provide the duality and to really
Mhm.
mirror things. And I think a lot of us are high-fiving in the astral plane going, wow, hey, thanks for, being that mirror for me. We all came here to have roles to play. So I know that's kind of a tangent about what I see, but that's how I would describe it at
Yeah.
this point.
Yeah, it kind of feels to me like we're in a bit of a pendulum swing right now. So, and we see this in history too. Like, there is truth to the phrase history repeats itself. And I think
Yeah.
I heard somewhere, and correct me if I'm wrong if you know the answer to this, I feel like it's every 20 or 40 years where kind of we go through cycles and things like seem to get really, really scary and bad. And then they sort of like mellow out, like, in the 70s with like Vietnam War and all these like civil rights movements, and everything could have looked really scary and dark, but then it brought in a lot of like we grew up in like 80s and 90s, which was like very chill for the most part.
Yeah,
Like it
yeah.
was like,
Yeah, it was. We were on the
sitcoms
upswing.
and easy breezy, and like you could still buy a house with a reasonable amount of money and all these, like it was just really family forward. And then we slowly saw a transition into like, it impacting our food and then impacting all these different agendas coming through. And so we really hit a huge pendulum swing, which we're in right now. And I think the hardest thing, and I have the most compassion for this demographic of people, is the ones that are only aware of it today versus the ones that have been like gradually seeing what's been happening over the last 4 or 5 years at least, because it's a lot to wake up to and it can feel very stressful and intense for our nervous systems. And also like for those who are running a business, it can also be really stressful to hold your 5D vision and hold it in your heart, but still practically in this world, like show up and be aware of all the destruction and darkness and not let that impact your frequency, so to speak. So what would
Yeah.
you say in your best experience, how can you hold that frequency while still kind of functioning in like you're kind of half in, half out, really, it feels like sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to put it. And when I created one of my programs, Transcending the Matrix, which really kind of comes back to that sovereignty, and like really my life's work is about that less than the business. Business is just my genius and it's a great way to support people with that vehicle. But I do feel like right now the ability to dance with both worlds
Yeah.
is how we expand the capacity. It is how we step into the frequency of the new earth, or whatever we want to call that paradigm, because it isn't about just moving yet, in my opinion, onto that timeline where we're not dancing with the reality around us. That's called bypassing.
Yeah.
So I feel like, we want to build ourselves up, in my opinion, to spend more and more and more time in that frequency, which is going to look unique and different to everybody. And it's also how can we bring that into our everyday situations and scenarios, coming back to sovereignty and self leadership, and also being able to like let things roll off and detach
Yeah.
from things, be able to look at it, because I do think that's a part of how we move through this. And we all have these roles to play, and so some people I feel like are meant to wake others up, and some people are meant
Mhm.
to try to change the government from the inside, and, do all these things. But I think for many of us, it's actually the energy of what we do and who we are in the four walls of our house, of like
Mhm.
who are we when nobody else is looking, all the way down to like the little microcosms of how do we nourish ourselves. We're actually regulating ourselves, like a regulated version of us is a more high frequency version of us. And also just the decisions that we make. So if somebody is feeling, let's say, alone and stressed, like do they make the decision to seek out like-minded community, or do they go into like numbing and
Mhm.
maybe environments and communities and things that actually deplete them rather than build them up. So all of these like little decisions that we make, I feel like is how we end up spending more time in that frequency, which means we're more embodied and really spending more time on that timeline. So it gets to be more and more and more. Like I remember earlier me on the awakening path was like kind of a stress case. And honestly, things were really fear based in my world for a long time. Like there's a lot of stories I could share around like the spiral and like series of events that created for me. And I wasn't feeling safe. I wasn't feeling regulated. So I feel like the more work we do to really ground ourselves, the more we can hold that vision, the more we can
Hmm.
hold the reality, like literally and energetically.
Yeah, you said something briefly, which is so perfectly describes it, where it's like the frequency that we're, for lack of a better term, searching for is regulation,
Yeah.
which, like, again, not sexy at all because it requires inner discipline and structure and that grounded energy when so much of this world wants to distract us and pull us away from our sense of self, our sense of sovereignty, our sense of truth, our heart, right? And so much
Yeah.
of what we're seeing really wants to really focus on the division rather than the unity. Meanwhile, I truly believe that in our hearts, if we were tuned into that, we would all know that that's actually out of alignment for really the expansion of this humanity in general. And it's so interesting to think about how tapping into that frequency could be as simple as like choosing what you eat rather than like thinking about it from like I have to be in a Zen meditation for 10 hours to get to the certain elevation in my activation. And it's like, no, there are practical things to do to help you be able to hold that vision and be able to stay in that frequency. But more importantly, I'd love to hear if you're open to sharing, um, just for the relatability of it all, what are some of the stories and stressors that you did go through that woke you up to realizing this is not the way I want to live?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a million probably stories I could tell, but in terms of the ones that come to mind, and just for like a little bit of kind of context and backstory briefly. So I feel like my awakening and kind of leadership journey started about a decade ago because I was just living a completely different life at that point.
Mhm.
Like it's like I don't know if you ever have these experiences, but I think of that and I'm not disconnected from it. Like I can remember, but it's also such a different
Yeah.
life and timeline where I'm like, whoa, okay, like it was really a pivotal time about 10 years ago because I left a toxic relationship and kind of, started my path. That's really where it started was kind of claiming my self-worth and getting into personal development at like a surface level because at that point I was just kind of, as I would say the average Walmart shopper. Like I hadn't done any kind of personal development work. I had never learned about mindset. I had never thought I could do entrepreneurship other than like me dabbling a little bit with network marketing and stuff. It was just very like a very linear kind of paradigm
Mhm.
where I didn't see anything beyond that. And so it was revolutionary to be like the first person in my family to like graduate high school and to put myself through university.
Wow.
Like that
Yeah.
was radical. And that was like as radical as I thought things got. And then I just had my little job and I had my little place in suburbia and I had my little car and I had been with my ex-partner for 7.5 years. And so I met him when I was really young. I was 17. We moved in immediately. He had a son, and I spent 7.5 years as a full-time stepmom,
Wow.
and pouring tens of thousands of dollars into lawyer fees to support my ex with getting custody of his son. Except while all of this was going on, my ex had major addiction issues and was just, ultimately a very wounded person. I've done a lot of forgiveness at this point, but there was a lot going on in terms of like physical abuse. And anyways, it ended with a restraining order. And that was like a huge
Yeah.
moment for me, like it really now I can see sparked so much. And around that same time, I had also gone on a huge weight loss journey. And I, had been really unhappy and unhealthy in this relationship. So I gained a lot of weight and I ended up losing about 70 pounds. That journey
Oh.
started while I was still in the relationship, but like really amplified after I left it. And so that also was like this catalyst, for so
Mhm.
much more. Cause I then got into like health and fitness, and then I started going to the gym, and then I got into network marketing because I was really into some certain protein shakes, which funny enough led to meeting my husband. So it wasn't all fear based because there were some good things that
Mhm.
came. At this point, it wasn't really fear based, anyways. It was really just like these catalyst moments that were like
Yeah.
popping off. And the network marketing showed me entrepreneurship and showed me, wow, like there's other things I can do. And then I was all into personal development and learning social media marketing. So then we go back to about 8 years ago. And so I'd had this huge growth period, but I was still in my job and hadn't really gone all in on my business. And that was kind of like the final piece, I would say, was to quit the
Mhm.
job, start the business. And then everything kind of opened up in many different ways from that point because I started traveling pretty much full time. I'm like a slow mad. Like I've moved around a lot, but not where I'm jumping to 27 countries for a week at a time. Like I've been living in places for 3 months to a year, but there's been a lot of movement. And where the fear piece comes in, because it was around 7, 8 years ago as I started traveling, I started to wake up more to what was going on in the world, and at the same time it was more of a knowing. I was
Yeah.
going down certain rabbit holes, but I wasn't piecing it all together. It's just kind of downloaded to me is the best way I can describe, and I started seeing a lot of the illusion and the corruption, but I wasn't really, listening to like ascension YouTubes and stuff. I was just seeing that there was a lot more in the
Mhm.
world to what was really going on. And there was this subtle fear, I think, from the knowing, but not also wanting to look at it at that
Yeah.
point. So it was
Relatable. Yeah.
subtly, yeah, it was subtly fueling my life. And so the biggest symptom, I guess you could say, of how this showed up for me was actually related to us moving around. I remember one of the first big ones was it was 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and my husband and I decided to move to New Zealand for a year. But there was this weird underlying energy, and I'm glad we did it. It was great. And I also didn't realize the grid working aspect and
Mm.
stuff of what was going on. But there was fear. Like we had this sensation like Canada's not safe. Things are going to be happening in the future. Don't know what. We need to start looking and exploring like other places to live. So then we tried Australia, Bali, New Zealand, and decided to come back to Canada. And this was 5 years ago from now. We came back to Canada, and then things, it was pre COVID, but by then things were amping up a little bit in our awareness. And still, all the pieces didn't click. But I remember us coming back to Canada and saying, well, we need to be in the mountains, but we don't want to be where we normally are in the western part of Canada because there's probably going to be like a US civil war or something crazy is going to go on, and
Mm.
we don't want to be like on the border. So there was like underlying fear. So we moved to Newfoundland, got to Newfoundland
Totally
and
opposite
realized,
side of the
yeah, we're
continent.
like,
Yeah.
where has mountains? We're like, it has mountains. Oh, and it's like further away from the border, we were telling ourselves. So it would be fine. And we went through the rigmarole of trying to move to Newfoundland, and it really wasn't for us. And we came back. And then shortly after, COVID kicked off, and kind of everything started to click at that point, and we went even like deeper into research of a lot of different things and went into this full-on earth warrior, wake people up but kind of save them kind of mode, which was a whole initiation in itself. And also there was even more after that. We tried moving to Nicaragua twice. We threw money of like all of our savings into a land development new earth community thing, which it wasn't a scam, but it also crumbled. But really, like the decision behind it was fear based. Like we had honestly only been in that country 5 days and like threw our savings into something, like didn't use discernment, didn't research. Even leaving the country was like a huge thing. And when we left, we didn't even mean to go to Nicaragua. We were trying to go to Costa Rica because it seemed like where all the cool kids were
Yep.
going, and it seemed like a good place. And we almost accidentally joined a religious sex cult and
Oh
then
no.
realized what was happening, and so we got
Uh-huh.
diverted to Nicaragua. So there's been like so much moving which has all been divine and perfect. But until more recently, it was underlyingly fear driven.
Yeah, you said so much juicy stuff in there that
Yeah.
I was like, oh man, I can ask you so many
Yeah.
questions. But what I think is the most important thing to articulate for those who are listening, what what's fear-based to you versus intuition? Because I think right
Mm,
now there's so much information out there that can trigger a feeling of fear, but then knowing when that's the right choice to make versus a fear-based way of operating, like almost running away, maybe is a little bit of what I
yeah.
heard in some of what you were sharing there too, of like, nowhere is safe, and so we have to like find the safe place, which is like searching for safety, and instead of realizing, and maybe that's a bit of it, but I'd love to hear your riff on like knowing the difference
Yeah.
really in the body, but when you're doing it, what are the signs of a fear-based choice?
Yeah. I think this is a really good point for us to touch on because I feel like it's been my life story or lesson, especially in the last decade or so. And I would describe the fear-based living, leading ourselves from a place of, and you kind of hit on this, it's when we're running away from something
Mm,
versus when I feel like we're running towards something. Like when we're running
yeah.
towards something, like as an example, I helped about 1,000 people. It was a weird other that could be a side story if you want to go there, but I helped about 1,000 people move from all over the world, mostly Canada, to Nicaragua while I was there. I'd done a lot of research and
Wow.
somehow my name blew up and I ended up helping all these people. And ironically, decided myself not to stay there. But what I saw in that was a lot of people came for kind of those reasons, like a
Yeah.
fear, escape, panicked kind of energy. And then some people then figured it out, but honestly, a lot of people couldn't hack it. And they're like, what did I even do? And then they left
Hmm.
quickly. Some people within a few days. But then there was a lot of people also who moved to places like this where all they did was accelerate their timeline. It wasn't really fear based. They had always wanted to live there. They had always wanted to move somewhere else. They had always wanted those things. So it was kind of more like a kick in the butt to just
Yeah.
do what they'd already wanted to do. And so a lot of those people are still living and thriving in these
Hmm.
places because it was like a different frequency behind the decision. And of course,
Hmm.
there's, so many stories and layers for people outside of that where I'm sure many people, it's like they didn't know that they would love it and then they fell in love with it and they got what they needed. But also a lot of it was fear based. And that's where I found for me, I think the energy with fear, a big one is control.
Hmm.
When we're trying to control things, we're usually coming from a place of fear and kind of reactivity to things. And when we're in our power, when we're in our truth, when we're not coming from that place of fear, sometimes we make really quick decisions because it's coming from that place of knowing and alignment. And then sometimes I feel like we actually just need to give ourselves a hot minute and use some discernment and think and feel into things, not for ever and ever endlessly, because then we're probably not actually thinking and feeling about it,
Hmm.
but just giving ourselves a moment. Like when I think of when I left Canada to Costa Rica, from the moment we decided to the moment we got there was 5 days, which included selling our vehicle,
Wow.
rehoming our pets, selling everything we owned, and going through a grieving process at the time based on the story we created that we'll never see our family again. Like we didn't even tell them we were leaving because we're like, shit's going down. I just got carried out of a Save on Food grocery store here in Canada while people screamed manslaughter the day the mask mandate came in, and I'm like, I'm out. Like I was in kind of a trauma
Yeah.
reactive, got to get out of here energy, which isn't right or wrong, but that's definitely the
Very
energy that it
understandable.
came from. And then, like hindsight 2020, I, ended up coming back pretty quickly to Canada and kind of integrating that whole thing and then going back there from a more empowered place, still ultimately to come back again to Canada. And through that process, I did see the difference, of choosing to go because I felt like there was more for me
Mm.
there or like more to explore to really decide. And we gave ourselves a month that time to go through the same process of like selling our car and doing all the things, which still really wasn't much time. But in my
Yeah.
world, that was like enough time compared to the previous. And the best way I can describe it is the truth feels light in our
Mm,
body. It
mm-hmm.
doesn't always feel easy, but there's like a lightness to it, and this can be done with a pendulum or muscle testing or body dosing. But either way, I feel like the sensation is lightness. Like we don't necessarily feel friction or resistance in that heavy kind of way. And again, it doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but it has that alignment energy to it.
Mm-hmm.
But when things are not actually coming from that place and it's coming from, say, more of a fear place, that isn't our 100% like authentic true expression. Like it's not that fear is wrong, but when we're coming from that place, we're usually having that sense of heaviness, that sense of dread, that sense of fear. And a lot of the time, the real magic is if we can dance with that, we can process it a little bit, we can dig into it, we can often work the tools we already have to regulate ourselves, and we might still come to the same conclusion and outcome, but it's about not just reactively taking action on things
Mm-hmm.
and actually kind of bringing ourselves back down before we actually move, especially I feel like in, big life altering kind of ways.
Yeah, yeah. I think about too how much it takes practice to understand the difference between anxiety in the body versus anticipation and excitement because they can
Yes.
radiate very similarly. And I think the same thing too for in general, sometimes fear can actually be excitement in disguise because
Yes.
the irony is that a lot of fears that we hold in our body is a fear of what if everything goes right? And it's something that doesn't get spoken about a lot, but that's a big blocker for a lot of people's, say, success in business, but also success in life. It's like if everything goes right, when's the other shoe gonna drop? Or if everything goes well, like then what does that mean for me? And in a way we keep ourselves small or kind of hold ourselves back with that, not realizing like it might be under the shadow of fear of failure or fear of judgment, but then you go dig a bit deeper and it's like, oh shit, what if I get everything I want? Then what will happen? And then I have to deal with the grief and loss of the change. And then I have to deal with the emotions of the impact of how that will show up in my day-to-day life. And you mentioned grief a few times in your story there too, which I think is an important part in just the awareness and awakening piece too, because so many people
Hmm.
stunt their grief. And that's such a spiritual growth component in life is that grief of change. Because change,
Yes.
whether it's even good change, positive change, brings grief because it invites you to do something different than you've done before, even if it's an amazing working out well. And I'd love to speak to a little bit about that too, like the when it's going well and there is grief in the success and the leveling up your life, how do you stay on that trajectory, realizing like it's all working out, but also I'm terrified, but it's all working out, but also I'm terrified, it's all working out, like staying in that instead of hitting our own sort of imaginary glass ceilings.
Yeah, well, imaginary glass ceiling, I feel like is the perfect way to describe that. And just for everyone listening, like one of my favorite books that you should read if you haven't is The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks, because I feel like it really brings in the energy of what we're talking about and is a resource to dig into. Because one of the big things I took from that book that I've reread many times over the years is this idea that we have our capacity and oftentimes we'll self-sabotage, and this is where I feel like it ties into what we're talking about, where we can have these underlying fears where it's like, well, what if I do get everything I want in this area and it goes really, really well? But then it means I'm going to have to sacrifice that area. And we have all these little associations of what one thing is going to mean for another thing. And it might mean, well, if I have a lot of success in my business, then it's going to mean my marriage will fall apart or
Mhm.
whatever, whatever. I know for me, for a long time, I resisted making more money because I have like weird stuff with family members and stuff where, as it's played out over the years, like the reality is like a whole chunk of my family doesn't talk to me because A, they don't get what I do, but B, they think I'm a selfish bitch because I should just send all of my extended family money because they think I just sleep on dollar bills, which you can see I don't. And like literally have, sent me horrible messages and don't talk to me. And I had to dance with that. You know, I had to face
Yeah.
off with that because for a long time I resisted the thing I was saying I wanted and was taking the action towards
Hmm.
because of that underlying sense of basically, well, then I'll have to potentially deal with rejection from family. And I mean, a lot of the time, these stories aren't even real or true, they're just things we've made up. But I feel that nobody is ever going to create value for us in our life or our experience, including if we want to expand to experience and receive more. Like, we are the ones that create it every single time, whether it's financially or listening to this podcast or reading a book, and we get to take nuggets, out of it, not only to receive them, but also to ideally implement them, into our reality, into our way of operating if they resonate. And I think where so many people in our world kind of drop the ball right now is we feel like we need things. Like we feel like we
Mm.
need more love from our partners, or we feel like we need to make that next sale in our business. And I'm not denying the basic needs that we have
Yeah.
as humans, but it's usually because we're compensating for something that we don't feel like we are without that thing. Like, of course, yes, we can
Hmm.
have goals and dreams and go after the things and have desires and standards, but most of the time it's coming from this place of compensation because we don't
Yeah.
feel that we are whole. We don't feel that we are sovereign. We kind of leak our energy and power all over the place. And actually, we need to call it back because we're so worried about missing the shot. Like we're so worried about actually just expanding and going for our dreams that we end up kind of putting ourselves on the sidelines. And if we're not
Hmm.
actually playing the game, whether we're talking about the matrix or the game of social media and showing up or whatever that is, just the game of life,
Yeah.
well, then we're going to fail every time because we're not even in the game, we're in the sidelines. So I see us as players, and when we're actually playing the game, any professional sports person knows they're not going to win every single game. They're not going to win every match. And how that
Hmm.
translates for people like us, it's like, well, we're going to have launches that fail, and it's not even like a bad, we did something wrong. It's like literally, that's just how that match went. And what's the value that we can get from it? Something I ask myself all the time is like, what's right about this? Like when things happen, whether I was wronging myself for investments I've made or decisions or things that like went wrong, I asked myself like what's right about it, and I
Yeah.
stopped making all of these things so wrong. I stopped being so attached to everything and stopped associating everything that didn't go my way, kind of going back to the control piece as
Hmm.
a negative outcome because it didn't work, because like there's always something that worked about it, there's always something to
Learn.
glean, to learn, yeah, from it. And so I feel like the more we can set ourselves free around the things that we're saying are going to make us less than, or the things that we're fighting ourselves against, of having more money or more success or more visibility, more love, and we work with the capacity rather than just kind of subconsciously letting these systems run, that's where we develop the discernment. Like that's where
Hmm.
things really change and shift. That's where I think ultimately we step into bigger self leadership, and externally, then we actually do get the things that we
Yeah.
desire. And it doesn't come from a place of need and lack and desperation. It comes from a place of, it kind of comes back to regulation, really, where it's this normalized, like, yeah, of course I can have this or receive that or experience that. It's not like we're clinging and trying to, like, pull it into our reality or escape something as
Hmm.
well in order
Hmm.
to have something. Like, a lot of us are actually trying to escape through things like our business or our relationships from the other things that make us uncomfortable.
Exactly. I had a really big question pop in my brain, which I'm just going to ask you because probably I'm going
Yeah,
to ask you the
I'm an open
question.
book.
So, when we're thinking about living like a soul-led entrepreneur life, a new worth leader life, and we're doing all the spiritual work, we hear a lot about detachment. And it's kind of what you were emphasizing a bit too, of like not having a need. Except I think the hardest thing to come to terms with is needing money,
Yeah.
needing finances. And what would you say to the person that has a grasp on the concept of detachment from a spiritual perspective, but maybe is either on one side of the spectrum, like giving away business stuff for free and not making any money because they're just like give, give, give to everyone, or the other side of the spectrum where they're like, holy shit, how am I gonna pay my rent? Like, what can I do in order to survive? And then how do I get back into that middle of like, again, that frequency of trust and sovereignty? What would you say to either
Mhm.
side of that? And how would you support a client, for example, if they were like in the midst of that dilemma?
Yeah, yeah, I love this question because it's layered, it's human, it's real. I think it's more real than ever for a lot of people just in our current
Hmm.
financial climate of the world and just the process, right? Like we've got more people than ever who have either lost their jobs or quit their
Yeah.
jobs to follow their passions. And entrepreneurship, number one, I feel like isn't for everybody. Like it can be, and I see people's higher potential for that. And it's not easy. It's not simple.
No.
It's not what, like we do our best to make it simple. At least that's my mission, but it's not, put a week in and then make millions of dollars, which I was saddened to find out. I know when I started my business, and I remember when I started traveling and I literally mapped out this little business plan. I had no idea what I was doing. And I was like, okay, so if I sell 1,000 courses, I'll become a millionaire. And I mean, I had no audience. I was in the backwoods with no Wi-Fi. I got schooled pretty fast
Yeah.
and realized, I still needed to make money and do things and figure my shit out. So from the lens of like if somebody is like really at that kind of survival kind of point, I honestly find like it's not the best energy to grow a business. And
Yeah.
there's many exceptions to this. Like I'll be honest, not in like I'm special or better way. I think I was one of the exceptions, whether it's my human design or right place, right time. I didn't have savings. I didn't have a backup net. I didn't have a rich husband or rich parent or somebody, and when I quit my job, like there was no plan B and things didn't just immediately take off. And I feel like I had the grit to like see it through. So I think that was
Hmm.
like where I was kind of the exception.
Hmm.
And I did what is something I honestly recommend a lot of people in that position do. I got a part-time job, which was actually more full on than I wanted. And that was a whole kind of journey. Like I was new in my biz, really wasn't making much of anything yet. Like, we're talking like 0 to like 2K or something a month. Like I was figuring it all out. And I ended up getting a waitressing job. So this was like 7 years ago in my first kind of year of full-time entrepreneurship. I got a waitressing job, which I did for like 6 months. And it kind of got to the point where it was no longer helping. Like it took the
Yeah.
pressure off. So then I started to actually feel a bit safer and like less kind of salesy in my business, in terms of like pressure and like seeing everybody as like a hopeful, I hope they buy, like, because I need to buy some groceries kind of energy. Like my basic kind of needs were a bit more met at that point. And that helped me to get things going. And then there kind of became the opposite effect though after like 5 or 6 months, where number one, they wanted me to work more and more hours. And
Hmm.
all of a sudden, I felt like it was not helping, it was hindering because I felt like I was starting to have momentum and things happen. So then I had to kind of go through the bold move of that all over again and quit that job. And then I use that as a catalyst because then I sold out my first retreat that month for 18 women and held my first retreat and had no idea what the fuck I was doing. But it like, and then I started traveling and I never got a job after that. But during that time too, I had to figure out like what would be supportive
Yeah.
versus not. And so I remember I went for an interview to go back to corporate and I was having this panel interview at a local college to go back into HR and I had to like put on the pantsuit and stuff. And of course they offered me the job, but then I called them back after like 3 interviews and then they offered it to me and I called them back and it wasn't even me, it was like an out of body experience. And I said,
Mm.
I can't take it. And they're like, what? I'm like, I don't want it. I'm just like hung up because that was too far, of going
Yeah.
back in the other direction. So I feel, in short, on that side of the spectrum, sometimes we actually don't need to step back at all from our business, but we need to get creative. We need to, whether that's like asking for help, if we have people we can get help from, if that
Hmm.
means getting a part time job, like doing other things, because I find for most women, creating on our edge, like our literal edge like that, doesn't always work that well. And it actually just slows the growth of the business because we're just
Yeah.
not in a very good state. So I think like that's something that not enough people talk about, or they hold shame because they have like another job where actually I'm like, you're a
Mm.
total badass that you're juggling
Hmm.
all these things and you're providing for yourself. I think it's great, and it doesn't mean somebody's less all in on their business. And actually, sometimes it forces people to be more discerning within their business because so many people come in and they're doing 200 things, but they're not necessarily income generating things. And it's coming from ego or proving themselves. And it's like it kind of calls us to better manage our time and be intentional to grow our business because we don't have that time to dink around if we're also
Yeah.
juggling other jobs and roles. So that's like one side. And on the other side, like sometimes maybe we're not in a total survival situation, or we do have those things already set up of whatever that looks like, or we have savings, or we
Mhm.
leverage some debt for a bit in order to, keep growing the business. And when we feel like we're trying to just like get things, like we're trying to get the clients in the door, we're trying to get more money, we need to kind of flip the paradigm on that. It's more of a mindset frequency shift to relating to our magnetism of what if we actually perceived ourselves as somebody who was going to be gotten, like not like
Mm.
taken, but like
Yeah.
gotten, like what if people actually really wanted what we had to offer, and we're like more from this giving energy and less from the getting, because a lot of us feel like we're pouring like all this free value and stuff, but we're still actually operating from a getting, not a giving
Yeah.
energy and frequency. So sometimes we need to flip the paradigm on that. And of course, there's also the camp of people within all of this who are kind of running that wounded healer archetype kind of
Hmm.
thing. And so it's actually about opening ourselves to receive and seeing ourselves as somebody who can be abundantly paid for our gifts, for our work in the world, and kind of just raising our standards around that. A lot of boundary work and stuff usually bleeds into this of, getting okay with rejection, being okay that we're not for everybody, being okay that not everybody can afford our things, like all of that stuff too, which
Hmm.
is, I think, definitely a part of the conversation.
Yeah. I find it so common for those who are like healers or helpers or who have that in them to end up doing one of two things or both at some point in their journey. And I agree with you. I don't think there's any shame that needs to come towards like doing the stepping stone thing to get you to the next thing if it's going to help your body feel safe and secure. Because like you said, entrepreneurship is not for the faint of heart. It isn't really for everyone because it does require you to regulate your nervous system on a daily basis because you just never
And be
know.
totally self-responsible.
Exactly. You just never know, and you're dealing with, like you said earlier, like rejections, you're dealing with failures, you're dealing with lessons and learnings, and it's so expansive. And if your body isn't ready for that, that's okay. Like there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And sometimes that's a time to like partner with someone, or that's a time to collaborate, or that's a time to,
Hmm.
you know, be okay with your purpose not being your vocation, because that word
Yeah.
gets mixed up a lot, and I don't really think they're the same thing at all. And realizing that sometimes like you can live your soul mission and work at the Gap, like you can,
Yeah.
there's no rules around that. And I do remember talking to a couple clients about this who were just feeling this pressure to like figure out who they're meant to be and what their purpose is. And I don't know how you feel about this, so I'm open to you riffing on this after I share, but I basically ended up telling them like you are your purpose. It's not what you do, it's how you show up in your world and impact those around you. And it's less about, again, like how you're making money or like what you're doing as a job. And I think we need to like take off that perfectionist pressure of needing it to look a certain way. And I do feel sometimes for those who are in this journey of awakening, it can also come with like that spiritual ego coming up front, going like, I know I have to do the spiritual thing, but sometimes the spiritual thing is not monetary. Sometimes it's like you're that person that goes to a retreat once a year with a sound bath and ripple into people's lives, and that can be good enough. Like that can be
Yeah.
your soul mission and feel really good about doing that without having to monetize everything. Because this is also the thing I've noticed in a lot of trends, especially on social media. It's like trying to monetize literally everything. Oh, this is my new hobby. I'm going to sell it now. Oh, this is my new trend I'm doing. I'm going to sell it now. And it's like, can we not just enjoy what we enjoy for the sake of enjoying it? And I think knowing the difference is key. And I think that maybe that's within the body too. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I love this topic. I feel the same. I feel that our purpose is usually linked to our passions. Like
Yeah.
it's who we are, it's how we show up in the world, it's the frequency that we operate at and the ripple effect that that has in the world. Like literally just who we are, what we embody in our lifetime is really what our purpose is. It's not usually just one thing, and it
Hmm.
doesn't necessarily have to be contained to what our business is or what our hobby is. Like those are things that bring us joy, those are experiences that we have, and those are kind of, especially with businesses, vehicles that we create. And I feel that somebody could be living, let's say, a totally 10 out of 10 purpose filled life and not have a business, not be in the online space, not have a
Yeah.
movement or anything. Um, and it can take a lot of forms. Like I think of someone, like one of my best friends is a biologist, and her I see her as like one of the biggest new earth leaders and people that I know, and she isn't doing any of those types of things. Like her purpose, her passions, which then extends into her work that she does in the world, is like going and helping frogs cross the highway that otherwise would be getting wiped
Aw.
out and they're endangered, and she bikes back and forth for like 3 months
Yeah.
a year on a
Aw.
bike for 20 kilometers in the night with a headlamp through grizzly bear country because she's helping toads and frogs cross the road. And I'm like, that's hardcore, you know? And like that's somebody like in
Hmm.
their element. And then for other people, I think it takes the form, and it doesn't have to be our whole identity, which I think is kind of where all this gets messy for people, where their
Hmm.
whole business becomes their identity, or their career becomes their identity, or their relationship becomes their identity. We like to fixate on that stuff because we want to know like who we are and why we came
Yeah.
here, which is hard to define and at the same time simple to define. And it's not defined by these external things that we get to choose to experience. And so I think also a lot of us have a calling. And this is kind of more into like the mission side of
Hmm.
things, and we may have multiple missions, you know, that we're called to bring forth in our lifetime. And from a business lens, I feel like this is where a lot of people are called to create more of a movement,
Yeah.
with their work, where it kind of goes beyond like a me centric or just like a simplistic business where it's like, hey, I offer this service, you receive this benefit. And like that's the exchange, which isn't right or wrong, it's just transactional. And some of us, many of us, are being called, especially in the spiritual community, to have that bigger ripple effect of our
Hmm.
world, which kind of comes back to the purpose. And, you know, really for a lot of us is coming back to that 5D state. It's coming back home to ourselves. It's coming back to regulation. And so, business being a potential vehicle for people is a way to help accelerate that process and like use our gifts to help that. And then I feel like we're creating movements with that, which ripples out. And so I think a lot of the time, though, people just lump all of that and they just use
Yeah.
one word and they're like purpose or mission.
Yeah.
But there's layers to this, and I think the
Mhm.
foundation of it all is who do we know ourselves to be, which is really like the lifelong question, and yet we all kind of already know it. It's just kind of coming back to it and making our decisions from that place, and being in a place of knowing ourselves, but also knowing we don't know what we don't know. And there's a lot more that we don't know than what we do know. And that's kind of the fun piece I feel like of life, is being that student and having openness and curiosity, and not getting into that rigidity control place, which is actually moving us off of our purpose, I feel, in this lifetime.
Yeah, it's almost like when you listen to what excites you, you listen to what you enjoy, you listen to what your body is saying yes to, you just start naturally taking those steps towards it. And then I don't know about you, but I just find I don't even ask the question anymore. Like it's like I'm grateful that I had a very aha moment, like in my training for counseling and coaching, where I was like, this is what I'm meant to do. This is my purpose. Like I had a
Hmm.
aha, like I knew it. I will caveat that I also knew it probably when I was like a child because I've been everyone's therapist their whole life, and so I kind of like intuitively knew it was just now a readiness to step into that. And I think that's the other
Yeah.
piece is like a lot of our pain points and our traumas and those scary bits of ourself, our shadow that we don't really want to look at are so interconnected to that mission in life, like the big mission of like I have a big mission of I don't want women to ever have to feel like they have to do it all alone. And I want to help them step into big leadership because I needed to step into female leadership. And also I often felt alone growing up. And I don't want anyone else to feel that way. And I don't want anyone else to have to go through some of the stuff that I went through as like a very strong, independent woman who sometimes wasn't that strong, but pretended she was. And so that's the mission component, but my purpose is really to, I think, like be in my own heart so that I can communicate that from a place of like generosity and
Hmm.
authenticity and empowerment and really helping other people realize that like yes, those sad, scary parts oftentimes in the childhood experience or early adulthood is usually connected to why we feel passionate about certain components. Whether that again becomes a career or not is somewhat irrelevant because I think too, if you are, say, on a mission to radiate more love in this world because you didn't feel a lot of that growing up, well, you can do that as a veterinary assistant, or you can do that as a healer, or you can do that as a podcast. Like there's no rules of what that can be. And I think leaving space for it to be an inner knowing and an inner remembering takes maybe a bit of that pressure off too.
Yeah, it's like the ability to interpret and let it be expressed rather than trying to chase it. And I also think this is where feminine masculine dynamics, which normally I would say like isn't gender specific, but if we actually make this more gender specific, and ultimately, somebody like there's lots of women who are slightly more masculine in their energy blueprint than a man and vice
Yeah.
versa. But ultimately, the way I think of it is the masculine is driven by purpose and feeling like they're on purpose. It's not like
Hmm.
knowing the purpose, it's like feeling like they're on purpose and kind of on their edge and really experiencing life in that sense. Whereas the feminine, it's more about feelings and it's more about
Hmm.
community. It's about being held, it's about feeling cherished. And that could be interpreted as purpose. And I feel like when we stop trying to always chase the external piece, the purpose kind of finds us as well because it is just who we are and how we
Yeah.
operate and how we interpret our life and how we lead in our life. I think of someone like, say, my husband, where when we met, he was suicidal, like depressed on the floor for like basically years. And like it kept coming back to one thing is, I wish I knew my purpose. I wish I knew my purpose. Because he
Hmm.
was just like a man without a purpose because he was trying so hard to find the purpose. And so he would like start different business ventures or do different things because he'd be like,
Hmm.
this must be my purpose. And now, years later, all of that kind of led to him being a more integrated person who felt more on purpose. Go figure.
Yeah.
And, then has allowed him to express that purpose in more aligned ways, not because the things in the past were per se unaligned, but they were coming again from that more heavy force kind of energy. So, from a practical level, they didn't really work that well. But when he was more unattached and just free and flowing and expressing himself and really coming from that place of creating, which I feel like is really what we're all here to do and experience as humans running around in this little earth realm, then he started having more fun with it. And then things actually started working more. And that kind of translates into anybody listening to this who has things like a business, because that is having a purpose led business, is having fun with it. Most of us aren't having that much fun with it behind the scenes, whether we feel alone, or we're trying to control, or we're trying to create from shame. So when we can set ourselves free from that and realize our purpose is really to live a joy-led life and that we're the only
Yeah.
ones who can rob ourselves of that, if we can give that back to ourselves through the permission we give ourselves and how we lead ourselves, then in my opinion, everybody is living on purpose.
Yeah. It, and I imagine, maybe I'm wrong, but I bet you your husband probably relates to a lot of men who are feeling the way that he felt. And now he has the
Hmm.
empathy in order to support that exact demographic going through, I'm purposeless and suicidal and depressed and what's the meaning of life? Big, deep conversations, most likely because he had to go through that. And maybe if someone's listening and kind of feeling a bit of that, like down in the depths of like everything's hard right now, you're birthing your purpose most likely. Like it's almost always in there. Um,
Yeah.
there there's a lot of truth to dark night of the soul and having that moment of like surrender and having to go into those deep, dark, scary places to a rock bottom can be a trampoline or it can be a
Hmm.
pit that never ends. And that's the difference between like a resilient person who starts to have a spiritual practice to see the bigger meaning in life versus that other person who goes into their own victim cycle. It's only me and no one else gets it. What's the purpose in life? Like these really conversations that don't lead to anywhere and leave any space for possibility and keep us sort of in that pit. Because the dark night of the
Yeah.
soul moment is oftentimes the catalyst to awakening, as you've said in your story a few times. And for me too, it was very much like really intense, scary times of like divorce and eviction and health crisis and all these key moments. And granted, you can find meaning in life not having intense amount of
Yeah, it
struggle
doesn't
and
have to be
strife too.
extreme.
It doesn't always have to look that intense, but I will say it maybe this provides comfort if life is feeling intense for someone who's listening right now too, because often there is an awareness that can come when we lean in a little bit more and relax into it as opposed to fight it. And then that's when almost like that trampoline can bounce us back up. It's like, oh, I was scary
Yeah.
this whole time and it actually wasn't that bad. Like I hit the rock bottom and then I just came back because growth is usually not that linear. You don't just keep going down, down, down.
Totally. Yeah, and I think sometimes we get into the short-sightedness of things and don't allow ourselves to zoom out and kind of see the macro
Yeah.
picture of our lives, the tapestry that we're creating, the collective of what's unfolding, and really just looking at things with a bigger lens, which can make things also feel, I find, less intense as well when
Hmm.
we do that. Like it can make things feel more intense, but I find oftentimes it puts things a little bit more into perspective and we can go, does this actually matter? Like this thing that is chewing me up or is making me feel terrible or stopping me from my dreams, like does it actually matter? And when we are in a lack of clarity phase, I really do believe like the best thing we can do is move. Like whether that means move our body or make a decision or say yes to something or no to something, but kind of waiting for clarity to drop in, I find doesn't really work. It doesn't mean we need to bypass or force things or, just start doing things from fear. It's just knowing that we are really powerful creators, and if the energy feels funky or unclear, it will clarify if we actually just start to move. It's kind of like if you're in a dark pond and your feet are in the mud. If you just stand there, I guess
Yeah.
maybe somebody might find you and save you, or, like something might drop out of the sky and you can pull yourself out and get to shore. Like, it doesn't mean you can't figure it out if you stay there. It just might take longer than it needs to, versus if we actually like take a look around and realize how smart and innovative and sovereign we actually each individually are, and then we actually use our creative potential to come up with solutions and make decisions and move forward, and then we realize like, oh, all I had to do was lift my feet and
Yeah.
oh, like I made my way back to shore.
Yeah, I often think of that scene in Indiana Jones where he's being chased by the boulder And then he
Yeah.
just needs to put his foot out and then the bridge starts to appear. But if he didn't have that inner self-trust and faith, it's terrifying. And you have to take that courageous leap for yourself because as uncomfortable as it is to hear, there's no one coming to save you. It might be happenstance that someone comes in your path, like you said, but we have to really realize that that self-empowerment and sovereignty comes when we realize that, like, and we soothe also the inner child who wants to be saved and that little girl that wants to be rescued, be the damsel in distress. Like, we give voice to all those parts of self, but then realize at the end of the day, like, I had to come to terms with, like, I didn't actually want to be saved. I didn't actually want someone to solve it for me. I don't want someone to rescue me. I want someone to, like, reign my kingdom with me. Like I want the equality there in a partner. I want the camaraderie or collaboration or like there as opposed to come help me. I don't know what to do. And that helplessness, as much as it is valuable to give voice to those parts of self when we're in that depth of despair, I think realizing also like the right support to help you discern and so you feel ready to take that next step because sometimes some people also need a hand to hold when they're walking into those next steps of life and need to know it's safe to do that. And that's the benefit of working with coaches like Jenna and I. It's like she really helps people in those components of business, which is like so parallel to life because business is so connected. It's like, I'm terrified to launch. And sometimes we just need to say that. And I'm sure you do this a lot. I've witnessed you do it in your community, which I'm a part of, which I highly recommend people join, by the way. Um, but just having and knowing that there's someone on the other side of that that's going to hear that and respond to that and be like, keep going is so important to feel like it's like, yes, there's no lack of empowerment when you want support when you're doing the thing, because there's a difference between like if I was scared and I was like, Jenna, I'm terrified and I don't know what to do with this launch, you wouldn't be like, okay, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm going to also get this set up for you and I'm going to do all the steps for you. And like, I'm going to just take care of this. And so then you can just relax and not worry about it. Like, that's not what a coach is. That's a caretaker. That's a codependent
Yeah.
person, right? So realizing the difference too of like, oh, when I reach out my hand, it requires vulnerability to receive that support. But again, full circle back to the very beginning of this conversation, like discerning who is that right hand to hold you when you're making those courageous leaps into the next levels of life and expansion. And it's so important to discern your life partner, to discern the coaches that you work with, the mentors you work with, and the spiritual support that you have, because very easily in those vulnerable moments, we can be taken the wrong way if they're pulling us off of our path to their path, right? If they're taking us on their own journey of what they think is best for us, then that's something to be highly aware of and also something to be discerning with too. It's like, how can that person, like, I just visualize like it's like holding our hand without pulling the hand. It's like,
Yeah.
I'm here with you. When you're ready, let's go. You're leading. I'm just there as like the map holder sometimes. Like that's really what the role of a coach and mentor is. It's like I see the map, I see what's possible. You can't see it yet, but I'm also letting you feel empowered to ask for that help when you take those next leaps.
Totally. Yeah, I see it as it's like take my hand and we'll walk together like on this path, and we have this roadmap. And say if somebody's going, it's kind of this energy, like if you're going on a road trip with your coach or your mentor, you're the one in the driver's seat,
Mm-hmm.
they're the one in the passenger seat as your guide and support who's there with you, but you still are calling the shots, but they're looking at the map with you and they're going, oh, there's actually a
Yeah.
shortcut here. And you're like, oh, that feels really good. Okay, I'll go here. But then you still have control if you want to divert and go over here, or you want to accelerate over there. And I think that is at least the expression of a healthy dynamic of, what it can look like and feel like.
Exactly. So, all that being said, um, what are the best ways that you feel are really supportive to the people that you want to come into your world? Like, how can they find you? How can they connect with you? How can they also experience that level of support that you offer, also with your level of consciousness that you bring to your support?
Yeah, thanks for asking and giving me the opportunity to share. I think some of the biggest things, because I love being a guide, I love
Mhm.
being a resource for people. So if you are listening to this and you want to check out my world and my work, even just plugging into my socials can be an activation in itself, because most posts I put up are like a mini masterclass in themselves. So you can tune in that way. You can go into deeper connection with me and my work by coming onto my podcast. And there's an episode on there or coming out soon, depending on when you're listening to this, with Rachele. And that could be a really great starting point to come and continue the journey and tune in on the Soulmate Strategy podcast. And if you want to learn more about my work, the main ways I work with women are primarily in community, in my membership, in my mastermind. So you can learn more about those by just sending me a message or checking out my website, which is all under the brand of Soulmate Strategy. So you can check those things out. And I'm the kind of person where my inbox is always open. I'm happy to have a conversation. I like to really
Is.
know my community.
Yeah, and I really want to emphasize too, the way that you facilitate groups is such an inspiration for me as well. And I'm so grateful that I came across your work because you lead with such generosity, but also innovation as well, and really holding the vision for each person. Like, you have such a knack for seeing the individual, but also the group. And if anyone hasn't done group work before, or is like, no, 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 I need individual support in this, there is something about the way that you hold space and also the power of being in a container with other women who are going through something similar to you that honestly is priceless. Like, it's just so important. And I highly, highly recommend. She's also for the human design nerds a 4-1. So community, community, community is Jenna's jam, and it really does show. So I'm so glad to be a part of your membership community. In It's just been such a powerful like push in behind the scenes of my world. And yeah,
Mm,
my heart's full of
thank you.
gratitude for you. Before we wrap
Likewise.
up, I want to check in with you. Is there any final last words you have to say before I ask you the final question that I ask most people on this podcast?
Yeah, I feel complete. The one thing that pops up is kind of my motto that I share. I'm surprised with all my tattoos that I don't have a tattoo, but it really is, I feel like, my philosophy in life, which is to hold the vision, not the circumstance, to
Mm,
really allow ourselves to dream bigger, get connected to our vision, really hold it, meaning, which can look different for everybody, whether that means that we are, writing out our journal vision every day, or we're visualizing it, but like actually connecting into that vision and practicing, because it's a practice, but to be unreasonable, to be unwavering in the vision, to connect to it in the kind of way where we don't need to know the exact timeline, we don't need to know the exact how, but we also can trust and feel so connected to it. We know it's happening, it's inevitable, and then we can lead ourselves from a place of, oh, how can I support the process? How can I accelerate the timeline, rather than it all being like the weight on our shoulders to like live or die, win or fail, and instead hold the vision no matter the circumstances and step into that next level of really empowered and embodied leadership towards what our dreams really are.
love that. Love that. Thanks, Jenna. Well,
Yeah.
last question, and this might be one that you tune in to answer. I usually invite people to do that. Um, what is one truth from your heart that you feel the world needs to hear right now?
That's a beautiful question. The first thing that comes through is we're closer than we think. I feel
Mm,
like on an individual level, like towards our dreams, our goals, our visions, and as a collective in terms of our conversation today around the shifting into these higher timelines as a collective, like from that dominant timeline, because there's multiple timelines that are playing out and happening that we can access, and that's where we can quote, jump onto these timelines, but there's still the dominant collective timeline that's happening that we see in our linear reality. And sometimes it feels like shit is getting a lot worse, like we've talked about before, it gets better. And I do feel that the actual template, the coding, the blueprinting of this higher level frequency is already alive and activated here on planet Earth. We're just in this lag effect right now of kind of playing catch up to living that reality. And so we are so much closer than we think. And we don't need to put a time on it and try to control it, but really holding that in our hearts that it actually is here now and we're in the transition, but it is available for us to access more than ever before.
yeah. If there's anything I've learned in my own journey, frequency and energy move fast. Our bodies take longer to catch up. And
Yeah.
we're in a physical body. So even if our
Yeah.
souls are like, I'm ready for 5D, it's like body's like, you need to do a bit more to otherwise, like, who knows what would happen, right? The impact that that would have. And sometimes we have moments of like extreme shock and detox, and then our bodies are ready to jump in. But really, it's again that patience of like the body is the vessel right now too. And so we got to take care of that part of self and allow it to go at its own pace and patience through all of this because, you know, in what you share, like even though it's dark and scary right now, it's almost that same parallel again of like darkening of the soul. Like even though it's dark and scary right
Hmm.
now and heavy, we it's usually meaning big changes happening at the same time because again, darkness and light, they're always parallel. And so, yeah, when the body is ready, I think the collective will be ready, but it takes time for that. And time isn't linear and it doesn't always go as fast as we want. So, just my final thought too is patience in your growth and
Yeah.
patience with yourself as you're learning all these new components about life and business and the world. Take your time and don't feel like you have to know it all. Don't feel like you have to do it all. Listen to what your body needs because, like Jenna has referenced many times today, the regulation component invites the higher level of frequency, but you can't regulate if your body isn't well. And
Yeah.
so, again, if your body is speaking to you, listen. And then that's when we reach out the hand and, reach out and ask for what we need and the support that we need. And it's totally normal and it's okay to do that. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's actually super healthy and empowering to ask for what we need and be
Yeah.
vulnerable even when we are struggling and in a challenged place. So listen to your
I
body.
love that. I love it. I think that's the perfect thing for everybody to just sink into right now because that is kind of our anchor and our root
Yeah.
in all of this. If we want to ground through the process, we got to be in tune with
Mm-hmm.
our body, which I know for me has taken a lot of shapes and forms and comes back really to all the things we've talked about today and even things like fear-based things. I know for
Mm-hmm.
myself for a while, I thought it was an empowered ascension decision. Personally, there's nothing wrong with being vegan or anything at all. And I think that's aligned for a lot of people. But I know for me, I was actually coming from a fear based place of, oh my gosh, well, I'm not going to ascend if
Mm-hmm.
I'm eating this and doing that. And actually, like that was a distortion
Mm-hmm.
program for me personally that was actually the opposite of helping me
Yeah.
to regulate and actually was messing my hormones and making me feel more disconnected, making me feel more
Me too.
pressured. Yeah. And, and so like those are the kind of things where I do feel like the body is really important because I know even with my husband too, like he was like really hardcore on that for a while. And then he got a message from source, from God, where he's like, if you don't shift this, you're not going to make it through the transition.
Hmm.
And that was like a huge shift for him
Yeah.
as well, to like listen to the body, and not the external of what people say is cool or what they say is required, or what is you got to do to ascend. I'm like, all of those things are like the most least spiritual thing to say, is
Yeah.
that there's only one way
Yeah.
to do this. And at the same time, I will say the way to do this is to be in our body, to be
Yeah.
connected. I fully believe we'll be at a point in humanity where we're full on breatharians and don't require food, and these things, but we are not there yet in the actual body, on a DNA level.
Exactly. I think listen to the body, but no one's in your body. So no one knows the rule
Exactly.
book for your body. And
Yeah.
this is why it's like blanket statement advice just doesn't work for everyone. It can work for a chunk of people, but it's not one
Yeah.
size fits all. And intuitively listening to what your body needs is really how you build that self-trust and that inner resilience and that capacity to, no matter what is going on around you, you've got yourself, you've got your center, you've
Yeah.
got your core, and you're doing what you can to take care of you. So let that be a reminder for everyone listening too. Like you say this phrase a lot, and so do I actually. Take what you need and leave the rest, because
Yeah.
ultimately you do really have to listen to what is true for you. There are universal truths. Yes, I do believe that, but I also think they resonate at different frequencies in different people's bodies. And sometimes those
Hmm.
truths aren't necessarily ones for you to embody. And so some people need to experience the hardship of attempting to embody those components. I, like you, had a health crisis when I
Hmm.
was vegan. It was not for me. It may be in my future. I don't know. But right now, it's most certainly is not. And that's okay. And now I know because I was listening to my body and figuring it out along the way. So
Yeah. So
again,
important.
like source God is you and your body. And when you connect to those parts of self, then you are tuned in to that frequency. And it's really simple when you come up with it and realize that it's not actually something so far outside of ourselves. So it's actually all the answers are in and through
Right
the
there.
body.
Yeah. Absolutely. Oh, I've loved this conversation so much.
Me too. Me too. Thanks for being here, Jenna. And yeah, I'm sure we'll have more.
Yeah, and thanks everyone who made it with us all the way to the end. We'd love to hear from you. Message us, let us know your takeaways, and
Yes.
until next time. And actually, next time, come hang out with us on my podcast and listen to the other transmission from me and Rochelle.
Sounds good. Yay. I can't wait.